So I'm Dr. Ron Alexander, and I'm delighted to be here. And this is the last in the series of a year-long series with the lovely Ora Nadrich, who is the author of Says Who, and she also has a new book coming out on mindfulness, and she's a mindfulness teacher and a life coach, and she's just a delightful host. And I am absolutely thoroughly thrilled to introduce my longtime friend, mentor, teacher, Dr. Daniel Brown from Harvard Medical School. I had the unique opportunity to meet him in October of 1970. And we were both students at the University of Massachusetts, and he was teaching an extraordinary course in the Project 10 experimental college called Altered States of Consciousness. And there were two Buddhist studies. One was a professor and one was a religious scholar, Joseph and Teresina Havens. And they kept saying to me in the entire month of September and October, you need to meet Dan Brown. You need to meet Dan Brown. Dan is a prolific author of 14 books on hypnosis, hypnoanalysis, trauma. He wrote an extraordinary book, Trauma, Memory, Treatment of Law, 5 books on meditation, the seminal book, along with Ken Wilber and Jack Engler, Transformations of Consciousness, and the extraordinary book, The Great Way. And then he just popped out a 1,000 pages on attachment theory. So Dan traverses both as a Western psychologist and also a trauma expert, where he has helped to prosecute a lot of the Catholic priests in Massachusetts for wrongdoing, and he also has been a representative at the Hague war crime tribunals, where his testimony has been taken with great seriousness and validation to also prosecute people there. So Dan is an extraordinary meditation teacher. I just came back. I was in Boston with him on Friday and Saturday at Harvard Medical School, and he did a course on mindfulness and peak performance in everyday life. Without any further ado, he's an extraordinary speaker, an extraordinary writer, and manifests in 101 different ways a true sense of Buddha nature.
Thank you, Ron.
Thank you so much, Ron. And I want to add to that Ron is my mindfulness teacher. So we're all in this loop together, actually. So welcome, everybody, to Sacred Sundays. This is the last Sacred Sundays of the year, and I am so honored to have Daniel Brown as our guest tonight. Thank you so much for coming in from Boston to join us here tonight.
My pleasure.
We are really quite blessed to have you. So there are so many things that I want to ask you. I just want to start with saying that we start the evening with a meditation, and I couldn't imagine anybody that I would want to guide us in this extraordinary opportunity than you, Dan. So if you wouldn't mind, we can begin the evening with a meditation.
It's okay.
Okay, thank you.
So, set up a meditation posture. It's probably good not to lean against the back of the chair. Can y'all hear me okay? But if you sit upright, you'll be more alert. And when you start meditation, it's a good thing to begin with setting your intention. So in Buddhism, we set the intention with bodhicitta, which means setting the intention towards awakening. So the first thing you do is sit down and you set the intention that you're going to engage yourself in this practice for the sake of awakening. That means setting aside all your limiting beliefs and taking yourself seriously. That you all have Buddha nature. You all have the capacity to awaken. And that's what you're doing this practice for. So that setting the intention is always there in the backdrop of why you're doing the practice. And may the strength of that realization plant seeds in the mind streams of all beings, eradicating all negative states, causing the flourishing of all positive states in an interconnected sea of beings. And once you set the intention, the next thing you do is you call forth in the space around you all the masters who've walked this path. If you have certain teachers you have a certain affinity with, that you know or know of, put them in the center of that space, as if they're all here to watch you as you begin to meditate. Imagine them looking upon you with kindness, offering you an encouragement, support, never judgment as you find your way along this path. And then in the presence of the masters, you make the request of what we call the gift waves of influence. You ask them to directly intervene in your mind stream and clear away all obscurations that might otherwise get in the way of your meditation. Activate all the positive qualities of mind and implant the views that will result in the realizations along this path. And having set up the gift waves of influence, then focus your mind on the felt sense of the body as a whole. And keep directing and redirecting the mind like a steering wheel towards the felt sense of the body as a whole as the concentration object. Not areas or parts of the body, but the body as a whole. And then in the center of the field of consciousness, allow the breath to arise naturally without forcing it. And when the rising breath occurs, direct the mind like a steering wheel towards the rising breath. When the falling breath occurs, direct the mind like a steering wheel towards the falling breath. And then in the interval between the breaths, however long or short that interval is, direct the mind towards the felt sense of the body as a whole. Rising breath, then falling breath, then felt sense of the body as a whole. We call that the three-point object. Now when you direct the mind towards the rising breath, engage the rising breath more intimately. Look more closely at all, so you'd notice all the subtle detail of the rising breath as a whole. Then when the falling breath is occurring, direct the mind to the falling breath and engage it more intimately. So all the subtle detail is something you begin to notice. In the interval between the breaths, direct the mind towards the body felt sensations as a whole. And engage it more intimately. Directing and then staying very carefully on the rising breath. Directing and then staying very carefully on the falling breath. Directing, then staying very carefully on the felt sense of the body as a whole. If the mind tends to get distracted, we call that Jesu-drangwa, chasing after mode in Tibetan. Turn the mind away from chasing after mode and just direct it back to the concentration object, the three-point object. The initial skill of concentration is staying on the object for longer and longer duration. Nepa in Tibetan, to stay continuously on the object for longer duration. In other words, sustaining attention. The related skill is detecting when the mind gets distracted more and more immediately and turning back to the concentration object and recovering. The more you stay on the concentration object, the more thought elaboration will wind down and stop. This meditation in Tibetan is called shine. Literally means staying - calming meditation. The mind stays more continuously. The background noise of thought calms itself and eventually stops. The mind stays fully concentrated on the concentration object. And you shut down mind-wandering mode. Now that you even have a little taste of concentration, let's bring it to a close here. Make a gentle transition out of the meditation now. We'll revisit meditation again at the end of the lecture.
Dan, you've been practicing and teaching meditation for about, 46 years. Can you please tell us why the path of Mahamudra meditation? Why is that the way to enlightenment?
Mahamudra, Indo-Tibetan meditation.
Okay.
Mahamudra is part of that. In old Tibet, about 200 years ago, there was a movement called Rimé, which literally means non-sectarian. It was founded by a Lama named Jungön Köntrul, and he wrote a 12-volume set called The Great Treasury of Meditation Teachings. And what's unique about that treasury is that it's like meditation's greatest hits. It's the collection of the best meditations across all of the years of Tibet, irrespective of school of thought. And that began a new movement that we selected, different levels of practice, the best practices for that level of practice within the whole domain of Indo-Tibetan teachings. So my own affinity is towards Rimé practice. We try and choose at different levels of practice the best. We tend to emphasize Mahamudra because at a certain point in the practice, because it gives very clear step-by-step instructions up to a taste of awakening. But beyond awakening, it's not so good to stabilize having awakening all the time. Dzogchen, which literally means the meditations that complete the path to enlightenment, those are better for that. So we'll choose different meditations for different stages along the path, all from a larger domain of Indo-Tibetan studies. There's 100,000 volumes written on states of mind in Tibet. It's been around a long time. That makes our 200 years of Western psychology look rather young.
What would you advise for the beginning meditator?
The clarity of the teachings is what matter in getting a good teacher. The style of... I taught with Tibetans for about 15 years. Tibetans don't know a lot about how to teach Westerners. They either teach they require you to do 100,000s of preliminaries, or they teach the advanced stuff very abstractly and don't make it available in a way that you can actually utilize it as a meditation. So, in the mid-'80s, I was visiting His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and he said, stick around a couple of days, there's somebody I want you to meet. He has a very unusual style of teaching. And of course, every time the Dalai Lama said, stick around a couple of days, it's changed my life. And he introduced me to a teacher who sat down and did 6 hours of live inner fire practice on the spot and walked me through it while he was doing it and had me do it along with him. I'd never had any detailed instructions like that before. And then he would, whatever I was doing wrong, he would correct it on the spot as part of the relationship. And after, they said, this is the way you teach Westerners, because our great tradition of growth is psychotherapy, which is relational based. And I think that after struggling with teaching with a team of lamas for a long time, the Dalai Lama thought that a relational based style of teaching would be well matched to Westerners. So the clarity of the teachings and the pith instructions is what matters, I think. Find the teachers who can do that to you. And particularly ones who will follow you. When I started teaching, I had an old friend of mine who was my roommate when he first came to the US in the 1970s, Rahab Tulku, who's an emanation of Padmasambhava, the great Tibetan master. And I said, look, if I can deliver you students who have a taste of awakening, will you stop the preliminary requirement and just teach them at that level? And he said, well, normally I would say no, but I know you. So he said, I'll come to your course. So he took the course and interviewed the students. He said, you don't care about the prayers or the rituals, but a lot of your students have a taste of awakening that's not stable. I'll do what you ask under one condition. You have to follow them on a regular basis between retreats. And since we were teaching a relational style of teaching, I said, well, that's a good idea. Why didn't I ever think of that? It seemed obvious once he pointed it out. So having somebody that will offer a relationship that can follow you and correct the bad habits of meditation is important. I spent 20 years as a Western psychologist doing outcome studies on meditators, and what we found is a lot of the stuff that's out there is sloppy. People make a lot of bad habits and no one's ever correcting it. It's not good enough to go to a meditation retreat for a week or 10 days or 2 weeks, and every 3 days you get interviewed in a group and you talk 2 or 3 sentences about your practice and saying, that's fine, keep on going. That's not good enough. Because what we found studying mindfulness people is a lot of them make a lot of bad habits of meditation and no one ever corrects them. So part of the problem that's happened with meditation in the West is the institution of it and mocking it. It's a sense in the expense of giving careful instructions and following the students carefully enough that we can correct their mistakes so they don't get into bad habits and move them along the path. So find a teacher that's going to form a relationship with you and move you along the path and has some responsibility to do that.
So is that a taste of awakening in the wrong hands? Or,
Well, I don't.
or bad habits?
I don't think so.
When you have a taste of awakening, it seems like you can never turn back again. So what happens when you have that first awakening experience?
You should be working with somebody who knows how to develop it with you.
Mm-hmm.
But look, mindfulness is very popular in the West. How many mindfulness courses you go to, they talk about awakening? What are we doing this for, folks? The whole purpose is to awaken and to develop into enlightenment and into Buddhahood. That's the heart essence of this tradition. We're talking about it as if it's just a technique that we involve ourselves in, rather than looking at the heart essence, which is the goal of this. The purpose of doing this is to reach awakening and to refine that awakening so you have it all the time. And to have that change your heart and your conduct so that you serve the benefit of other beings. That's the goal of this, is not learning a technique like mindfulness or concentration. So we're losing sight of the main heart of this, the more popular it gets.
And how do we bring that back on track again, being that it's sort of the train has left the station, this mindfulness movement?
All I can do is try and talk about what I believe in. And there's a lot that we need to correct in terms of the view of this, which I'm going to try and address this talk to tonight. Why do we meditate? Some of the views that we developed are simply not correct. I'm saying that as a practitioner for 46 years and a translator for 46 years, but also as a Western psychologist. For example, one of the views that developed in 1970 in Herb Benson's work was that meditation is a kind of relaxation response. Is that correct? Anybody who's done yoga class, what do you do at the end of yoga class? And what happens to your mind when you're lying there? It wanders and you get sleepy and you fall asleep and you get into daydreaming mode. What I'm suggesting to you is that too much relaxation is not conducive to meditation because it initiates mind-wandering mode. So that view developed is simply wrong. Meditation, anybody who's done it seriously, it's hard work. But it's work that leads you to clarify the mind and to move it in a positive direction. But if you, at the same year that Benson came out with his understanding of the relaxation response, there was much better work done by Akashidi in Tokyo. And what he actually did is took beginning and advanced Zen monks and wired up all the major muscle groups of the body. And the view he developed with a more careful and scientific design showed that meditation wasn't at all relaxing. It's at best seen as an even output and distribution of muscle work. It takes a lot of work to hold up the body posture. But the purpose for holding up the body posture is twofold. One is it guarantees an optimal level of alertness on the one hand, and it stops mind-wandering mode. It makes it easier to train the mind if you have a good posture. If you sit in a sloppy posture, you activate mind-wandering mode. So actually, meditation is probably better seen as not that.
Oh, your phone is wandering.
So, why do we start meditation? What's the starting point? The purpose of meditation is to train the ordinary mind. What's the ordinary mind like? We try and pay attention to something, 3 seconds later we're off onto something else. We don't have any capacity to sustain attention. The great American psychologist William James said 100 years ago that the average time we sustain our attention is about 3 seconds.
Why is that?
Because in this world now we get distracted by everything. And it's gotten much worse with all the media distraction. So we're learning to pay attention and sustain attention is a skill that we don't have anymore. We have great moments of forgetfulness. During the day we have lots of lapses. We forget what we're about and what we're doing. We get into mind-wandering mode. Neuroscientists have identified the neurocircuitry of mind-wandering mode. When you get into mind-wandering mode, you activate the medial prefrontal cortex, which is sense of self, the precuneus, which is imagination and reverie states, and part of the parietal system and the occipital system that has to do with dullness and sleepiness. So when we get into mind-wandering mode, our mind is dull, we have a lot of reverie states, and mostly the thoughts are self-referential, making ourselves self-important. One study did random beeping of people and found out that the average person spends 47% of their waking day in mind-wandering mode. What a waste of resources. So part of the purpose of meditation is to train the mind out of all these bad habits. So we learn to pay attention, that we learn to have continuous awareness, that we learn to calm all the background noise of thought, that we can actually shut down mind-wandering mode for something more meaningful. So that's the first purpose of meditation. The second thing that we need to correct is we have a view now that meditation is a type of psychotherapy. We have, as of 2010, there is 710 peer-reviewed papers on mindfulness-based therapy for pain, for headaches, for insomnia, for anxiety, for depression. The trouble is that that wasn't the reason that these traditions were originally used for. There's nothing wrong with using mindfulness for Western behavioral medicine and psychotherapy problems. But we've lost the heart essence of this. The heart essence of doing these practices is the experience of awakening. And as I'll talk about a little bit later, the experience of what's called Sangye. When Buddhism transferred from India to Tibet, the word for the realized person was called a Buddha. The word Bud means realized one. When these teachings were transferred to Tibet, that's not how they translated the term. The word in Tibetan is Sangye. Sangwa is its compound term. Sangwa means completely purified. Gyewa means flourishing. It means there's a certain level of practice you get to that you completely eradicate all negative states from the mind stream. There are no negative states left. And because the negative states mask the positive states, there's a flourishing of all 80 positive qualities of a Buddha mind. I happen to think that Sangye, complete purification and flourishing, has profound implications for mental health. We should be studying the heart of that. I'll talk a little bit about that later. We once gave the Rorschach ink blot to people at various stages of practice. People, when they got really concentrated and they stopped thinking, they just saw ink. They didn't make it into bats and butterflies and people. They just saw what was there. When people were at a stage of awakening, but it wasn't very stable, they were not reactive. They were not defensive, but they still had a lot of conflicts. And the awakening hadn't changed much of the underlying substrate of their emotional personality states. But when we gave Rorschachs to people who had achieved Sangye, complete purification, flourishing, they were like nothing we've ever seen before. They were absent of all negative states, and especially absent of aggression-related states. These are the great masters. We recently did a study on the neurocircuitry of awakening, which I'll talk about later. And we just got funding to do a study on the neurocircuitry of Sangye. We're going to look at what the brain's doing during these higher states. This is what we should be studying, the heart essence of these traditions, not just more mindfulness techniques. So I got to say what's true.
Oh, please.
So
Only that tonight.
Mindfulness is very popular, and it's useful that people now have, the whole culture has an exposure to a meditation that's a good, well-taught meditation. But at some point you got to go beyond it to say, what's the heart of this? Where do we want to go with this? So that's what I'm trying to do. the thing that changed my life the most was I've had a lot of Tibetan teachers in my life, but in the last 10 years I've worked with His Holiness Manfred S, the spiritual head of the Bon lineage, an old indigenous religion, who happens to be the Dalai Lama's senior Dzogchen teacher. And he's like no other teacher I've ever had before. It's changed everything.
Can you tell us a little bit about that, the Bon?
Well, there are 3 lineages of Dzogchen in Bon. What's called the Autry System, the final stage to this, the final stages to the path of Ah. and it started with 50 lessons that you do one at a time, up from the very beginning of practice up to full awakening, and then up to full enlightenment. And then over the years it evolved into 14 sessions, so I got curious about, well, what are the 14 sessions that seem to me most important to move you along so quickly? But then His Holiness taught me a one-session version of the whole thing. So we've translated all of that, and it's profound. But I should give more of a background before I talk about those higher states.
Can I ask you, Dan?
Sure.
You wanted to talk about the 3 maps of progress in Indo-Tibetan essence of mind meditations.
Yes.
Do you want to talk about
There
that?
are 3 overall sets of teachings within the domain of Tibetan teachings. One are the teachings that take you from the very beginning of practice up to a taste of awakening, however unstable that may be. The second are the set of teachings that teach you to have awakening all the time, on the pillow, off the pillow, and in all states, which includes being awakened not only during the day, but awakened and carrying that awakening into deep sleep and dreaming. So you have it all the time. And then the third map takes what's called the path of liberation, that helps you to refine the residuals of what's left of the ordinary mind and ordinary experience, up to the point that you open up the perception of the pure realms in the mandala. This is not an ordinary world. We are all deities in a mandala. And you start seeing more the sanctification of the entire world. And that opens up the perception of the enlightened Buddha bodies and enlightenment eventually. So the third map is the map that carries you up to liberation from all negative states, the flourishing of all positive states, and ultimately becoming a Buddha. So those are the 3 sets of teachings. All of these teachings are now coming to the West, and we're trying to make them all available.
The practices that extend from the beginning to a taste of awakening, which you spoke about?
Sure. There are 3 major developments in the history of Buddhism. They're called the 3 turnings of the wheel. The first are the teachings of Shakyamuni Buddha. The second are the teachings of Mahayana Buddhism. And the third are the teachings of the essence traditions, the Tantras, Mahamudra, and Great Completion of Dzogchen. And I like to think about these like the structure of scientific revolutions, that these are improvements. And it's important that particularly that Westerners should know this, because most of the teachings that are popular, Burmese mindfulness in the West, represents only the first turning of the wheel. And the first turning of the wheel, the teachings were on when Buddha got enlightened under the Bodhi tree, he went to the next town over and gave his first lesson. And it was the Four Noble Truths. And the first lesson was on the problem of dukkha, which was unfortunately translated as the problem of suffering. The world is full of suffering. But that's not a very good translation. The word dukkha means reactivity in Pali. And what Buddha was saying was that if you look at your mind very carefully, every moment of experience, moment by moment, if we like something, the mind moves towards it to make more of it. If you don't like it, it moves away from it to make less of it. So there's this incessant reactivity to our experience. That's the cause of suffering. But the problem with translating dukkha as suffering rather than reactivity is it leaves out the method, which I'm sure he didn't mean to intend. Buddha said you can look at your own mind and see that reactivity and you can change it. The second insight was that everything changes, nothing stays the same. And the third insight in the old Theravadan Buddhism was anatta, no self. If you concentrate for long periods of time, thought elaboration winds down and stops, so you get long periods of stillness, absence of thought. But self-elaboration winds down and stops too. So at some time during the meditation, your sense of self might drop away. So I might be meditating, and all of a sudden Dan-ness will drop away. And who's doing the meditation at that point? It's awareness that's doing the meditation rather than Dan. So that was called anatta. And then there was about a 500-year debate about that notion of anatta. And it came out rather different 500 years later. It was the theory of emptiness. Because some people felt that trying to get rid of the self was not the right way to go. And that moving beyond the self and seeing it as just an empty construction of mind was a more refined way of understanding this practice. And that came out as the theory of emptiness. That everything is just everything is a construction of mind, because the ordinary mind constructs. It makes representations. We have a self-representation for self, memories of representations. This whole of this world out here is a representation. You're not seeing the world out here. You're seeing your own representations. We don't even know what's out here. And Buddhism says, although the Dalai Lama likes to be a scientist and he likes science, Buddhism ultimately isn't a science. It's a soteriological system, which is a big word in history of religions. It means system of liberation. All the Buddhists care about is if you look at it a certain way and see everything as a representation, and it defines the way out of this mess, or if you like, the way home. If you look at it a certain way, it tells you that to move beyond getting caught up in all the representations of the mind. Because when we make representations, we tend to take them too seriously. So, sense of self, Western psychologists tell us, develops at about 18 months of life, roughly concurrent with the capacity for representational thinking. In everyday reality, it's useful to have a sense of self. In my case, Dan-ness. It becomes a central organizing principle in everyday life. I can organize my daily experience around Dan-ness. It gives me a sense of continuity over time. That's useful. It's just, but we forget that it's just a construction. We forget that what the Tibetans, the word is nosion, which means taking it as too real. It's like the English word reification. We forget that it's just a construction of mind. And there are two consequences from getting caught up in these constructions of mind. One is zinpa, the capacity to take things as having too much reactivity, too much grab associated with them. There's a lot of grab to the self. If you don't like my talk, I can notice the grab. If you like my talk and praise me, I can notice the grab. If I'm having a disagreement with my wife, there's a lot of defensiveness there. There's a lot of grab in that. Grab is perceivable. And the difference in the explanation of Mahayana Buddhism for suffering is a little different from in Theravadan Buddhism. It's not that the mind moves towards things to make more of it and moves away from things to make less of it. All that's organized around the self. So it becomes self-grab. And the second consequence is that if I develop these structures of mind and I reify them and make them too solid, it obscures the nature of awareness. I can't see the nature of awareness. It's always right here. And the whole point is to clear away these things, is seeing beyond them as mere constructions of mind and looking deeper into the mind, to the deepened layers of the mind's awareness. So emptiness becomes one of the essential features of the pathway. And all that is captured in the Heart Sutra mantra. Now I'll try and explain it to you. In Pali it goes like, in Sanskrit it goes like this. Gate, gate, paralasam, gate, bodhisvaha. Gate, gate, paragate, parasam, gate, bodhisvaha. Now here's what it means literally from the Sanskrit. Gone, gone, paragate, gone way beyond, parasamgate, gone way, way beyond, bodhisvaha. Ooh, what a realization. I'm going to suggest to you, my friends, that that's the entire path. And here's what it means. The ordinary mind reifies. It makes the structures of mind too real. We forget that they're just constructions of mind. And a good synonym for emptiness is that everything is just a construction of mind. So, starting the point, the first gate has to do with thought. We get caught up in thought. We make thought too real. This is something you know a lot about because you're an expert on this in your book. We tend to take thoughts as really too real. But the Tibetans would say a little bit different about that. What we do is we mix up thoughts and awareness and we see them as the same thing. And they're not the same thing. We've confounded two separate things, thought and awareness, as if they're the same. So how do I get back to operating out of awareness rather than operating out of thought mode? Because I spend most of my time operating out of thought mode. So the way I do that is to calm thoughts. And if I concentrate on, say, where we started this meditation with on the three-point object, and I continue to bring my mind back many times over to the concentration object, one of the consequences of bringing the mind back is that it stays on the object for longer periods of time. But the other consequence is that the thought elaboration winds down and eventually stops. Experientially, that means that if I'm really concentrating on the meditation object, I'll have long periods of stillness, absent of any thought. So if I have long periods of stillness and there's no thought activity, where am I coming from? I'm not operating out of thought at that point. And it's easy when you have long periods of stillness, absent of any thought, to see that you're really operating out of the intention of awareness. It's something different from operating out of thought. That's the first gate. You go beyond thought to the field of awareness itself, and you operate out of the intention of awareness. I'll give you a practical example of that. Major League Baseball. In a tachistoscope, which is a high-speed electronic board that you can flash events in thousands of a second. At one time, we brought our T-scope over to the Dhamsala, and the Dalai Lama gave us his top meditators. But under standard luminance conditions, it's an electronic board that flashes events in thousands of a second. You can measure, under standard luminance conditions, the speed of mental events. Thought is rather slow. It takes 3,000 milliseconds to 500 milliseconds to have a thought. A half a second to 3 seconds. Okay. Now, a fastball comes down the plate at 95 miles an hour. That takes 400 milliseconds to get to the plate. Imagine you're standing at the plate. If you're thinking, you can't hit that ball. Because thinking, the fastest thought is 500 milliseconds. The ball is faster than the thought. You can't hit it. But if you're directed attention, understand luminance conditions is about 250 milliseconds. You should be able to direct your attention to the point where the position of the plate where the ball's coming in and hit it. But if you wanted to be a great baseball player, the secret would be that you train yourself to operate out of the field of awareness and the lightning speed intention of awareness. Intention of awareness has directionality to it, but it's much faster than thought. And that's what Tony Gwynn did, who hit for the second highest batting average in the history of Major League Baseball. He had a pitching machine throwing tennis balls at 150 miles an hour. He wasn't trying to hit them. No bat speed could match that. But what he was trying to do is train his awareness to locate the position of the balls in space. And then when he could do that skillfully, he would have the pitching machine throwing fastballs at 95 miles an hour, and they seemed slow to him because his awareness was trained to pick it up, and he could match them with his bat speed one after the other. And what he did is he learned to shift his, we call it shifting your basis of operation, or where you're coming from. He shifted his basis of operation out of thought mode, out of attention mode, to the intention of awareness. He's operating out of that field of awareness. He's cleaned up thought. If you want a good Tibetan metaphor, we say that you're learning to operate out of the pure milk of awareness rather than out of the solid yak curds of thought. So anybody can train themselves by concentrating the mind in concentration meditation to calm thought activity enough that they learn to operate out of the intention of awareness rather than operating out of thought. That's the first gate in the Heart Sutra. You use concentration meditation to train the mind to stay on the object and to calm thought activity so that you learn to operate out of the lightning speed of intention of awareness rather than out of thought. Awareness gone beyond thought. That's the first step along the path. You follow me? But then, who's doing the meditation comes up. And the sense of self is guiding the meditation. So, in my case, it would be Dan's doing the meditation. But if I did emptiness of self, and I saw that Dan was just a mere representation of mind, I don't get rid of it, I just learned to shift out of it to operating out of the field, separating out Dan from that field. Dan's still there in the background. I don't have to get rid of it. So Mahayana emptiness practice is very different from the older Theravada practice of no self, or getting rid of the self. You don't get rid of it. But if I learn to shift my basis of operation by doing emptiness of self practice, that's the second gate. Awareness itself gone beyond self-representation. Then I would go back to the meditation, and it wouldn't be Dan doing the meditation. It would be awareness doing the meditation, or we linguistically mark it, Rangrig power, awareness itself, to show that it's a different level of awareness. Now I've gone one step beyond. I've gone beyond thought. I've gone beyond Dan-ness or sense of self to a deeper level of awareness. This is important because there's no concept of levels of awareness in Burmese mindfulness. So it's only something that comes out in Indo-Tibetan Buddhism. You're going to track these different levels of awareness all the way up to awakened awareness and ultimately up to enlightenment. It's the hyperspace pathway. It goes quickly. Then there's another problem, that awareness fluctuates a lot. And why does it fluctuate? Because of the convention of time. Psychologists tell us that the psychological sense of self is a representation that develops at around 18 and 20 months. The psychological structures for time develop more slowly. Children develop a sense of speed at around 2 years of age. They develop a sense of stories having beginnings, middles, and ends, the narrative structure about 4 years of age. But they don't develop a sense of locating events meaningfully in the calendar, like this event took place in this week, and this month, and this year, until about 8 years of age. I face it all the time in courts as an expert around child abuse cases, because if a 4-year-old tells a fragmented story, that doesn't mean the story is inaccurate. It just haven't developed the narrative structure of time yet. Or if a 7-year-old gives a narrative story of sexual abuse that's happened to them, but they can't locate it in time, that shouldn't be used to discredit the child. They just can't date it yet, because we don't expect them to be able to developmentally date it at that age. So time develops more slowly. And once we develop time on a relative reality, it becomes one of those stable structures of mind that's useful in everyday reality. That's why you can all show up to this talk on time. You meet deadlines. But time has a lot of grab, zinpa. We get stuck in traffic, we're running late. There's a lot of grab and a lot of reactivity to time. And also time has the capacity to obscure, we reify time. I forget that time is just a construction of mind, a representation. I think there's an externally cosmic time clock out there. I even located in Greenwich. We all located in the same place, right? There it is, we found it. What if time is just an empty construction of mind? Now this is a huge difference between the first turning of the wheel, Theravadan Buddhism, and the second turning of the wheel. Because in the first turning of the wheel, there's a point that you get to meditation where all thought elaboration winds down and all that's left is simply bursts in energy and movement and light at high speed movements. They're called mind moments. 100,000 mind moments in the blink of an eyelash. And if you keep looking at those, all those mind moments fragment and dissolve and disappear. In Pali that's called bhanganyana, or a dissolution experience. It's not very pleasant. It's often accompanied by fear or disgust. But by having the simplest observable events of your mind fragment and disappear, what's left is this massive field of a bright, lucid awareness. And if you look into the nature of that awareness, that becomes the platform for appreciating the true nature of that as awakened awareness. So it becomes the platform for awakening in the older Theravadan Buddhism. But then Nagarjuna came along and said, look, the idea that things are rising and passing away very quickly presumes the structure of time. What if that's an illusion? What if that's just an empty structure of mind? So he developed this funny thing called the Nagarjunan dialectic. When something arises in time, you take the perspective that it's not really arising because it's already here. When something goes away in time, you take the perspective it doesn't go anywhere but stays here. That's going to screw around with your sense of time. And if you keep doing that with every event, it flattens out time. And you have the window of opportunity to open up this immense, timeless awareness. And since time and space are related, it's not only timeless and changeless on the one hand, it's boundless and limitless on the other hand. Now that's a big shift. And you make that your basis of operation. That's where you're coming from. That's the third step in the Heart Sutra. Paragate, gone way beyond the convention of time to ocean-like, changeless, boundless awareness as your basis of operation. A huge change. And since everything is contained within that larger, limitless field of brilliant awareness, everything is interconnected within that. That's the foundation for the Bodhisattva path and actions. Because if everything and everyone is contained within that same field, we all influence each other. It doesn't mean that if you get a realization of that, everybody wakes up at the same time. But it does mean that all your practice and the strength of that practice has a subtle influence on the mind streams of all beings. And the things that you do in the world can't be oblivious anymore. It affects you. It affects everybody else. So that's where the idea that we all influence each other comes from, which is the heart of the Mahayana teachings. That's the second turning of the wheel. The third turning of the wheel is characterized by Mahamudra, the great seal meditation, great completion, Dzogchen, and the Tantras. And the metaphor that best helps you appreciate the third turning of the wheel is Buddha nature. The metaphor of the sun and the clouds. If the clouds are clouding over everything and you can't see the sun, and then the clouds clear away, what do we say? We say the sun comes out. Is that accurate? The sun's always shining. It shines day and night. But from our perspective, we couldn't see it because it was clouded over. Always right here is a limitless field of brilliant awakened awareness love that is your true nature. But you don't see it because it's clouded over. So when we say that emptiness is the path, we're saying that each step of application of emptiness clears away another cloud until there are no clouds left. And then the brilliant, awakened, radiant nature of an awakened mind is obvious. It's always here. It always has been here. So in the essence traditions, the theory is that the heart of this is all about Buddha nature and awakening to your own true nature. And the other thing that came out in the essence traditions is really strong is the appreciation that it's not all about suffering, that the positive qualities of the mind are much better to facilitate meditation practice and much better for mental health than just the eradicating suffering. Eradicating suffering doesn't lead to the positive qualities of mind. You have to develop the positive qualities of mind as important. So there's a much more emphasis on positivity in this third turning of the wheel. So how do we get to this next level of awareness, which is awakened awareness? Here's the key. The key is that the problem is our information processing system. Always right here is an infinite, limitless ocean of brilliant awakened awareness love that is your true nature. But you can't directly apprehend that through any structure of the mind that partializes. You can't become the wholeness through a partialized stance. This whole thing is like a video game you have to figure out. And the whole video game of our information processing system is set up so that it clouds over. The slowest operation of your information processing system is what? Thought, right. Mipam, the great Dzogchen scholar, says the function of thought is to delineate. If I have a concept about this, it's not about that. So any instant I'm in a concept, any instant I'm thinking, I'm not in the wholeness. I'm in a partialized stance. So thinking can't help me realize the awakened mind. I can't think my way into it. But if all thinking is empty immediately upon arising, and I don't get caught up in thought, I have a chance to recognize it through awareness itself. Next, directed attention. As soon as I direct my attention to this, it's not on that. But I can't attend to anything in any way, and even in meditation, that's going to lead to awakening. But if I have what's called a level of practice that's called a natural state and has no reference points to it and no point of attentiveness, and I'm not looking from somewhere at something, then I'm looking at the entire wholeness, the unbounded wholeness itself. I have a shot at direct experience of awakened awareness. And the third, the fastest operation of our information processing system, we don't even have a word for it in the West. It's called particularizing. It means the tendency of the mind towards something that makes it into something particular. See, Western psychology starts with stimulus perception. I see a stimulus and I react to it, right? Buddhist psychology starts pre-stimulus. There's a tendency to move towards something, the outcome of which is I'm seeing and recognizing a specific stimulus and then I react to it. So like an action potential. You want to see how that works? It's not hard. Everybody right now, just do what I'm asking. Take a panoramic view of everything in the room, or everything all at once. And hold a panoramic view. Everything all at once, like a child viewing a temple, taking everything all at once and nothing in particular. Keep doing that every moment by moment by moment. And what do you notice happening? You can't do it, because the mind keeps doing this. And you can actually see how the mind reaches out. It's what the poet Keats called reaching irritability. If you try and take a panoramic view, you can see the particularizing happening. So that the whole idea is to move you beyond conceptual thought, to move you beyond paying attention, to move you beyond particularizing and set up a certain view that will let you actually see that you are the unbounded wholeness of an awakened mind. And those are called crossing over instructions. We set up the view where you learn to orient yourself towards the unbounded wholeness and hold that view every moment. And then if particularizing happens, you begin to see it as part of the unbounded wholeness in such a way it doesn't cloud it over. And then you'll shift and recognize awakened awareness. There are two pathways of recognition. It's not enough to set up the view, you have to recognize awakened awareness as your basis. One pathway is called the pathway of non-localization. At some point you realize that you're not operating out of an individual localized consciousness anymore, but you're operating out of being the unbounded wholeness, a place that is no place, has no location and no reference point. Or, at some point you recognize there's something quite evidently distinct from awakened awareness to ordinary awareness. It has brightness, dangpa. It has awakeness, hirage. It has intensity, nar. It has softness, bole. It has sacredness, dampa. It has sparkling immediacy, trole. So there's something evident about awakened awareness in its brightness and lucidity, and it's just awake, that's different from ordinary awareness. So once you recognize that as something, it's usually quite familiar. You're recognizing and you found your way back to your true nature. Once you recognize that, it's usually a big shift. That's why it's linguistically marked parasamgate, gone way, way beyond the localization of individual consciousness in your information processing system's operation to awakened awareness. And it's accompanied by a huge metacognitive recognition that this is something quite different from what you usually experience. Bodhisvaha, ooh, what a limitation. What a realization. So when you have that, you see that you're operating out of that vast, limitless ocean of brilliant awakened awareness love. That is your true nature. How do you judge the authenticity of it? It's usually accompanied by moving your heart. If it's accompanied by spontaneous gratitude or devotion or compassion, you're on the right track. That's the first map. If you learn something in this path that self-importance isn't terribly important. Somebody once sent me a picture, it said, I finally looked at the bigger picture in life. I wasn't in it.
Okay, we have a lot more to cover in about 45 minutes. And as you can tell, Dan is really cramming a tremendous amount of valuable information for us. So again, Dan, we are blessed to have you here tonight.
Pleasant to be here.
So to continue on with, you wanted to mention something before covering the final two parts of the map.
Okay. I'll say something about the study on awakening first, because we just finished that. But I worked in collaboration with Judd Brewer at the UMass Neuroscience Lab for the study of mindfulness and the Fetzer Foundation, and I tried to convince them that maybe they should stop just studying more mindfulness as a technique and studying awakening as the heart essence of these traditions. So I told them I would give them subjects who could do awakening, but not all the time, so they could scan them in ordinary waking state, distracted state, and then in meditation conditions, including awakening. So we did that. We got very good results. We scanned 30 subjects in the ordinary waking distracted state, in the timeless, boundless practice, which is called ocean and waves, which I just mentioned to you, in what's called the refinement of that, the natural state where you have automatic emptiness of all conceptualization and all doing, so it's a state free of doing and free of conceptualization. And the next was the view that sets up awakening called lion's gaze, or the crossing over instructions for awakening. And then stable awakening. And in the 3 meditation conditions, we found strong activation in the anterior cingulate cortex, which is the concentration center of the brain. But the unusual finding was that the activity in the ACC was high frequency gamma activity. When the brain is active, it's beta activity. When it's more relaxed, it's alpha. When it's relaxed and daydreamy like, it's theta. And when in deeper sleep, it's delta, slow wave activity. This is the opposite direction. This is high frequency, fast activity. We found it in all 29 valid subjects. So we interpret that as that they were holding the view with a certain intensity when they were doing the meditation practice, so they didn't fall out of the view. But then when they were in the awakened condition and had stable awakening, they activated a part of the parietal system that's normally associated with shifting from local to global awareness. And the activity was also high frequency gamma activity, which is a very rare finding. So it means they're shifting out of local, narrow, localized consciousness to a vast, limitless, global, awakened mind. And they're holding that with a certain intensity of awareness. Gamma activity usually means that all the cells in that region of interest are firing, and they're all firing synchronistically. So what we found was awake means awake. And there is a very specific set of neural circuitry markers for awakened state. This is the first scientific study on awakening, and we got great results. And the Fetzer Foundation gave us funding to replicate the study with a more fine resolution functional MRI. And they also gave us the funding to study Sangye, the complete purification of negative states and the flourishing of positive states. So that's what we're going to look at in the next couple of years. So we're really trying to bring these teachings to the West and show that there's a scientific basis for the heart essence of these teachings. The second, I should say something about the second and third map briefly.
Yes.
The second set of teachings is what the teachings that helped stabilize awakening. When you first get a taste of awakening, it's not very stable. The habits of the ordinary mind come back. And the idea is to make it what Tasi Namgyal in the Mahamudra tradition calls, take the little flames and make them into a forest fire. So there are a whole set of methods to help stabilize awakening. On the pillow, you set up the view of lion's gaze and you shift from local to global awareness, and you do that many times. If you set up the right conditions, you'll shift it frequently, you'll shift it for longer duration, and you'll shift it more and more immediately. And after the awakening becomes a learned pathway on the pillow, all it takes, the sign of progress you're looking for, is that just the intention to look will shift your basis from ordinary mind to awakened mind. You can recognize it immediately, and you can do that frequently. That's the time to start taking it off the pillow. And that practice in Tibetan is called drewa, mixing. So you'll set up awakening on the pillow, shift your basis to awakening in a nice stable way, and then get off the pillow and go out in nature. And the task is to see how long you can stay out in nature and stabilize awakening before you fall out of the view and fall back in ordinary mind again. And if you do, go back to the pillow, set up the stages again, shift your basis to awakening, see if you can sustain it off the pillow in nature for a longer duration. Then you make a hierarchy of situations from easiest to most difficult to sustain awakening in. When I was doing that with His Holiness Menri Treasing, I spent a whole month with him and I never sat on the meditation pillow. He's about as busy as the Dalai Lama, and he had many stream of people who come visit him in his room, so that my task was to sit outside of his room with all the people who were waiting to have audience with him, and I'd have to converse to them while I was in awakened state. Then he would have me go work on the computer, and I had to think while I was in awakened state. So after a while, you mix awakening into all activities of mind, and there's no there's no loss of the awakening. And each time you shift from ordinary mind to awakened mind, you are dismantling the residuals, the habits of the ordinary mind, and after a while, there's no boundaries anymore. You're just awake all the time. Then there's sleep and dream yoga, and you learn to shift. You learn to set up a certain posture to go into sleep with and hold awakened mind, the brilliantly alert awakened mind during deep sleep. There's no activity during deep sleep, but the field of awareness gets brighter and brighter. You're not unconscious, you're not out of it. And you judge the progress by keeping the brilliant lucidity of awakened mind during all the phases of deep sleep. And because what's called the clear light of deep sleep is very similar to the clear light of dying, if you can recognize the clear light of deep sleep as a regular practice, then when you die, you can recognize the clear light of dying and become a Buddha in the dying process, when the thoughts and sense systems crash and burn and disappear. It gives you more of an opportunity to use that dying practice to become enlightened and become a Buddha. So, after a while, you hold the awakening all the time, and we say the view changes from the ground aspect of awakening to the appearance aspect of awakening. And so, rather than just holding this view of the limitless vast expanse, which in the totality of awareness, which is what sets up the shift to awakening as your basis, you start to look more carefully at what arises within that field of that expanse. And the view becomes a continuous, uninterrupted flow of liveliness. So all thoughts are lively awakened awareness. All emotions are lively awakened awareness. All sights, all sounds, the body sensations. The whole show is lively awakened awareness. This whole dance is lively, a magical show of lively awakened awareness, expressing itself to itself and knowing itself through its own expressions. So when you have continuous liveliness of awakened awareness as your view all the time, you can't lose awakening. And you develop what we call dengwa, confidence in the view. Even in the worst things in your life that you get caught up in, and if it clouds over, it's like a thin veil, and you know that all you have to do is put the intention to look, and you shift back to awakening immediately. So you can never lose it after a while. It's always with you. Then, when you have awakening all the time, on the pillow, off the pillow, during deep sleep and during dreaming, you have mastered the second set of practices, the second map. The third map is called the path of liberation. If you hold the view of the infinite vast expanse of empty awareness space and the continuous uninterrupted flow of the liveliness of what arises within that, and you hold both those views simultaneously, we call that holding the view of the inseparable pair. And all that's required is to allow things to arise without engaging them. In Dzogchen, mental engagement, when the mind moves towards something to make more of it, the mind moves away from it to make less of it, each instant of mental engagement forms a karmic memory trace. And all those karmic memory traces are put in a depository called storehouse mind. And depending on the strength of those and depending on what activates those, karmic memory traces ripen. And as they ripen, they influence your behavior, they influence your outlook on life, they influence the actual states of mind that you experience. But if you set up this view of the inseparable pair of, in the vast expanse, everything arises as lively awakened awareness, and there's no engagement of everything starts to pass through. And if you set it up practicing what we call leave it aloneness, but it's not a strategy, it's part of the view. You can't make it into something that you're doing. If you get it just right, then everything starts to release itself, and it forces the mind, because you're not forming new karmic memory traces, to reach into the storehouse mind and rapidly release all the impressions that you've accumulated for lifetimes. That process is called dharma dhatu exhaustion. You're exhausting the bin of karmic memory traces. The average time is 6 to 8 years if you do it 24/7. It becomes an automatic process. All the time you're releasing karmic memory traces. That's why it's called the path of liberation. And if you supplement it with other practices, you can cut the process down to about 2 years. There are 3 practices that you do on that third map to Buddhahood. One is releasing karmic memory traces. That's called the thoroughly cutting through a trekcho view of practice. That's the default option. There are 2 advanced practices. One advanced practice is you could purify the residuals of the physical body until the body is completely insubstantial. And you do that with what's called inner fire practice, tumo. What you do is you work with the central channel system. And you imagine a little seed syllable, like a little filament of like a heating coil in the juncture at the bottom of the central channel. And you imagine it, you take in the winds and the breath as if it's fanning the fuels of the flames. So the heating coil gets hotter and hotter. Just below the crown, you imagine like a robin's egg of what's called bodhicitta substance. And you imagine the heat rising in the central channel and starting to melt some of that bodhicitta substance, and the first few drops go down like grease on a grill. And it lights the fire up 10 times hotter or 100 times hotter. And then you imagine the heat rising up the chimney of the central channel if the posture is set up nicely. And then it starts to drip down, and you direct it with the mind to the throat chakra. And you collect it there. And that will open up a level of bliss. And then after you open up the full level of that experience of bliss at the throat chakra, you bring it down to the heart chakra and you collect it there. And then you bring it down to the navel chakra, and then you bring it down to the secret chakra. And those are called the 4 descending levels of bliss. Each one is an entirely different world. Then you bring it back up. That's harder to do. And there are 4 ascending levels of bliss. And by the time you finish all those 8 levels of bliss, which takes you somewhere between 6 months to a year, you've purified all the residual substantiality of the body, and you end up with what's called clear light body. The body is just a clear glass, like an empty glass bottle filled with light. And it doesn't have any solidness to it. So all the karmic residuals of the body are purified. That's the second track that you can take. You can purify memory traces, you can purify the body, and the third track is you can visualize, purify perception with what I call the bypassing visions. You learn to set up that experience of self-arising, self-liberating, and then you open up what's called the heart lamp. In the center of the heart, if you focus on that spot in a certain way, it will cause awakened awareness to flare up in its brightness, like the dawning of the morning sun. It will get brighter and brighter, like igniting a forest fire. And once that blazes, it will start directing an energy that will define its own pathway. You don't have to visualize the pathways. It all happens to itself, by itself. And the pathway we call it the Kati tube channel. It goes from the heart, it splits from the head and goes to the eyes. Now you have a continuous supply of fuel of energy to fuel the visions in the eye lamps. You look at the eyes like 2 crystal balls, and you take a certain gauge. You look what we call it a little bit below the eyebrow boundary, the eyebrow fence, and you look, and it's like looking. And what you'll start to seeing is that energy drops like boiling water will start to appear very fast, and filaments and splashes of color. And then the splashes of color will get more organized, and the filaments will get more organized, and there's a whole show of light that will appear in the first level of visions. In the second level of visions, patterns emerge, triangles and squares and shapes and forms. In the third level of visions is quite dramatic. You open up all the pure realms. You realize that there's not an ordinary world out here anymore. This is a world of an organized mandala. We are all deity bodies within that mandala. You only see the world in sacred terms. Everything is sacred. You've opened up the Pure Land perceptions of what's called the Sambhogakaya. You've already opened up the vast spaciousness of the Dhammakaya. And you do that until it's completely stable, so you can only see a sacred world. There's nothing else other than that sacred world after a while. And the key to opening up that Sambhogakaya perception is the purification of the residuals of the ordinary mind, whether you purify memory, or whether you purify body, or whether you purify perception, or all three, depending on how fast you work with it. Then once you open up the perception of the pure realms of the mandala, and that you live within those pure realms of the mandala, you start to develop this burning aspiration to help all the sentient beings in samsaric realms who don't see it that way come along that path and guide them along the path. And that creates an urge to engage in enlightened activity that will help move others along the path who don't have that realization. And that opens up what are called emanation bodies. You can make, just at will, you can make different copies of yourself in different planes of reality, helping out beings. Those are called the Nirmanakayas. Then all three of those Buddha bodies, the Dhammakaya, the Sambhogakaya, and the Nirmanakaya, all come together at once in a stable way, and you lock into the structure of ultimate reality. You are the structure of ultimate reality. There's no uniting with it, there's no separating from it, it just is. And at that point, you're a Buddha. And you engage in incessant and enlightened activity, helping all of these other beings along the path. Game over. Those are the three maps. This is the time that all these teachings are coming to the West. And we're trying to make a complete log of all these teachings, including the most advanced teachings. That's why I get a little impatient when we just talk about meditation and don't talk about where it takes us. Because there's a certain endpoint in mind that's, in my point of view, is very valuable. This is the time that we want to make Buddhas in the West. We want as many girl Buddhas as boy Buddhas.
Yes.
So, a couple years ago, I mean, all these teachings were given to me by His Holiness Menri Treising. He wants these teachings to, he's very pragmatic, he wants these teachings to survive in the West. And about 3 or 4 years ago, he sat down and he put all these texts in front of me of all the secret advanced cave and hermitage yogi practices, the most advanced practices. And he said, look, if we don't find a way of preserving these in the West, there are very few Tibetans that can do these anymore. They're all going to die out. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to translate all the texts of the cave and hermitage yogis and translate them accurately. I'll give you a team of lamas to do it with. I want you to put them in a form that Westerners can actually do them and record it, either audio or video or filming them, so that Westerners can actually use them as a permanent log to practice from. And make them available to the West in a way that preserves them. So through my foundation, I had a benefactor match my salary at Harvard for a couple of years so I could take a couple of years and suspend my clinical practice and just do this. What am I going to say, no? So I felt I had no choice to do it. So now I have to say that all the cave and hermitage yogi texts of Shadza Rinpoche, who was the greatest master within the Bon tradition, have all been translated. We understand how they work in the West, and we have a complete log of them. Some of them involve what are called trilko, or very advanced yogic exercises, which are very difficult for an old man like me to do. So I said to His Holiness, look, we can't just write down and say, put your hand here and put your foot there. It's okay to film them. He said, yeah, make a complete film log. So we made 2 professional films of all the advanced yogic exercises. We have a log on all the secret practices of how you extract vital essence from the universe. You don't have to eat food for months or years when you're in the cave yogi. We actually know from a scientific point of view how some of this stuff works. All the teachings on the bypass and visions, the inner fire practices. We've actually done the inner fire practice with Westerners in a way that we got them to work. We're now teaching them. And we have a complete videotape recording of all the inner fire practices from beginning to end. So, and including the consort practices, the inner fire practice you do with a sexual consort. There are probably 6 people on the planet who know how to do these things. In the monastic tradition, they're all going to die out. So he said, preserve them. So we got a cave yogi, and we said, would he teach these to us? And he said, the Lama that I translated with, he's never going to say yes. And he said, not only did he let us translate it, he said, yes, he would teach them. He let us videotape all the transmissions. So I think they're very pragmatic. They understand that there are very few people that can actually do this stuff anymore. Mm-hmm. And that's where you all come in as Westerners. Unless we find good yogis who can do this stuff, they're all going to die out. So I'm racing against time, folks, here. I got about 10 or 20 years left in this form body to preserve these teachings, and that's it. So then they're all gone, and I think we're going to make the deadline.
Mm. Beautiful. That's hopeful.
That's what I'm working on.
Wonderful. Why don't we open it up to some questions here?
Sure.
Who would like to ask some questions?
Evelyn?
Yes.
Yeah. You've given some timelines on things, like Dharmatata exhaustion, 6 years. Do you have one for awakening? Once you begin the practice of Mahamudra, how long that might take somebody on that path?
I don't want you to get into a limiting belief. Awakening is always right here. It's the quality of and clarity of the instructions that gets you there. There's no timeline. It can happen in a second. But we've kept statistics on our courses in the last 10 years. And it's been fairly stable. About in a week, the courses are 8 days, as you know. And it's been a relatively stable figure. Around one out of 3 will get a taste of awakening. Not very stable, but they'll get a taste of it in a week. It's not bad.
No.
Yeah.
You talked a little bit about taking awakened state into sleep.
Yeah.
Is there a way to, so you have lucid dream experiences, to bring lucid into your waking day also? Does it work the other way too?
Well, this is different from Western lucid dream research. Western lucid dream research is about ordinary awareness carried into the dream. So you have ordinary awareness during the dream, then you know you're dreaming. But this is very specific. It has to be awakened awareness, it can't be ordinary awareness. And we get into that confusion a lot because we don't emphasize awakened awareness in the West. Even most of the people who teach mindfulness don't emphasize awakened awareness. It was Reichung, the student of Miller-Raper, who said that there are different levels of awareness, and you can see that in the Heart Sutra mantra that I talked about. But we're losing sight of that because mindfulness is just one level of awareness. It doesn't have any notion of different levels of awareness. And certainly when we talk about lucid dreaming, it doesn't talk about awakened awareness, it's just ordinary awareness. It has to be awakened awareness. And in dream yoga, there are 4 practices. The first is sustaining awakened awareness during the dream. The second is really interesting. It's voluntary control over the dream process. And they particularly have you work on psychic abilities, supernormal abilities, like walking through walls and leaping over a mountain in one leap and reading minds and things like that. And the reason why they do that is they say it's easier to break down the limiting beliefs about psychic abilities in the dream than it is to break it down in a waking state. So they do a lot of work on that. Secondly, the third is called Pelwa, or which I translated as increasing, and the Lama that I translated says, no, it means multiplying. And I said, what does it mean? It means you make multiple copies of yourself. You can make thousands of copies of yourself in different planes of reality. It's the epitome of multitasking. So you learn to make multiple copies of yourself and emanate in different realities. And then the fourth is you practice seeing this reality here as a dream. And so there's no difference between this dream reality and dream reality. And then the implication, of course, is if this is no difference, then you should be able to do those psychic things in the waking reality the same way you did in the dream. And they're pretty explicit about that. In the Bonn tradition, with His Holiness Mandri Treasing, one of the things that's, they have a whole set of teachings on how to read minds. And he is the lineage holder for that, so he's not subtle about reading minds. Whenever I am in retreat, he knows exactly what I've thought and what I'm doing. And at first that was weird, but now it's sort of it was good, because when I go in a retreat, I sit there for a month or so, and then 4 or 5 times during that time, I'll just visit his room, and he'll just look at me and say, "Now do this." Well, one time I was working on the bypassing visions, and they were really working, and I was excited about them. And I said, "I want to talk to you about the visions." He said, "I already know about them." And he said, "You're getting attached to the state." And I said, "Well, let me tell you about it anyway." He said, "Well, you can, but you don't need to." So I started talking about the visions, and about 2 or 3 sentences in, he said, "See what I mean?" And I watched this butt come up in my mind, and I thought, we both started laughing. I said, "There's nothing else to say." So it's useful. But they're not subtle about it. And of course you move along the path because he sees where you need to go. But I've taught now for 46 years, and what he told one of the lamas that I teach with is that the reason why you can teach with Dan is because Dan levels the courses. There are eligibility requirements. You can't take the course to stabilize awakening unless you have awakening. So all the advanced courses are on permission of the teachers only, and we follow the students carefully and track where they are. So because of that, they were able to be flexible and give up the usual 100,000 preliminary idea, because our demonstrated competency is the requirement for the advanced courses, and he trusts that. So given that, he's willing to give everything out, including all the advanced cave yoga teachings. I said, look, if I give you a group of couples who can do inner fire practice in a stable way, would you teach them the consort practice just so you have some Westerners who can preserve this stuff in the West? And he said, of course. So now we have a cave yogi who's teaching those people that practice, because if they don't, it's gone. So they're right, they're quite pragmatic about it. If they don't preserve these things, they're gone.
Somebody else?
Yeah.
I'm aware that you have written a book with Ken Wilber, and
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you mind talking about what that book is about.
That's an old book. It was work that I did in the 70s, and it was published in 1986. It's called Transformations of Consciousness. And at that, early in my career, and I was in graduate school, so I was learning the languages. I had learned Tibetan, I had learned Sanskrit, and I had learned Pali. So I took the 3 stage models for the system, the Visiddhamagga, the path of purification in Pali, which is the old first turning of the real practice, the stages of practice in Theravadan Buddhism, which I had learned in the 1970s in Burma. I actually practiced it. And the second was Patanjali's Yoga Sutras from the Hindu tradition in Sanskrit. And the third was Mahamudra in Tibetan. And I lined up all the stages, and despite the differences in the language, you could show that there was a deep structure, that the stages of the path are the same across all 3 traditions. The experiences are not, because of the different perspective, particularly between the Hindus and the Buddhists, but the actual stages are pretty much identical. That was the first way of sort of mapping out the stages. The book's hard to get now, it's sort of out of print. We were going to print it again, but Ken had some of his stuff in the book and he thought was outdated and he didn't want it reprinted. But Shambhala was going to reprint it, so it's now harder to get now. Yeah.
Are you in the awakened awareness state right this moment?
Yes.
Can you please share your experience with us and maybe how this room feels like to you?
Always right here is infinitely vast, limitless ocean of awakened awareness love. And right now, you are a salient being in that that's precious to me. As clear as I can be. Hi.
I just been accepted to my first Vipassana meditation sit, and I was wondering if you've done that before, if you have any tips that you would share with someone who's a little nervous about the silent meditation for 10 days.
Yes, I did it a lot in the 1970s when it was just getting popular, and as a psychologist, when Insight Meditation Society developed in Barre, Massachusetts, since I was in Boston, we did 10 years of outcome studies on the 3-monthers. I would go up there the first day and do some sort of measure, and then 3 months later when they came out. And I also, in addition to studying with Western teachers like Jack Kornfield and Joseph Goldstein and Sharon Salzberg and all those, I got interested enough to go to Burma, and I studied with Mahasi Sayadaw directly when he was alive. So he was my teacher. He was the one that began this whole movement. But I think it's a very useful beginning meditation. It's widely available to people, so as a beginning meditation, it's useful. I have 2 criticisms of it I have to be honest about. One is I don't think it's well taught, so that there's no way of following people and carefully and give them careful instructions. So when people get into bad habits, they develop the bad habits over time and they're not corrected. So we see a lot of people who come to us from the mind tradition that we have to correct a lot of sloppy habits. And secondly, I'm not of the view that silent retreats are particularly useful. And I'm saying that as a psychologist who one time did research on sensory deprivation. And in the Christian Desert Father tradition, there was a work written by Johannes Cassian, who lived with the Desert Fathers for 2 years and gave them a very positive billing. But he was critical about the extremes of sensory and social isolation from extreme meditation as an artifact that makes the meditations more complicated. And he listed them as, eventually that got misinterpreted as a list of the 8 deadly sins and virtues. But it was really about the extremes of sensory and social isolation in long retreats. So, for example, when you isolate yourself from the world, what's the first thing that comes up? You give up all the busyness of intersensory deprivation, and you give up all the busyness of everyday sensory involvement. He called it gluttony. I think about when I take my kids camping when they were younger. What do you do all weekend when you take your kids camping? You eat. So you get preoccupied with food when you cut down sensory involvement. The second was lust. The second deadly sin was lust. Then you're sitting there in a 3-month retreat, and then the second week in the retreat it dawns on you that the love of your life is sitting 3 pillows away. Only you never met her, so you sit there fantasizing about how you're going to bump into her during your silent walking meditation. Because the social isolation is unnatural. And if you continue to deprive yourself, then you start getting into what he called avarice, hoarding behavior. That's when the people would take the bananas and the apples and the fruits and pile them up in their room. They're all going to go rotten. You're not going to eat them, but you have to have something. And the fourth was dejection and anger. At some point, if you still deprive yourself, you get pissed off. And the fifth was sloth and torpor and acedia, or agitation of mind and body. And if you get through all that, the last thing that comes up is pride, the problem of who's doing the meditation. And what Cassian was trying to say is these practices are very valuable, but if you do them in the extreme, it actually creates an artifact of other problems. We don't do silent retreats. We give people breaks and we let them talk, and because we think that the relative reality is the vehicle for awakening. If you can't maintain the awakening in all of this thick of relative reality, it's not good. Not good enough from our perspective. So I'm not so romanticized by silent retreats. I think they create problems. And that's just a personal opinion that's somewhat backed up by the work by Cassian. Cassian did something else that was really interesting. He had an 8th deadly sin that was only reserved for spiritual practitioners. It's called spiritual pride. And what Cassian said is the further along you get, the more that's a problem, not the less. That's why it's important to practice in lineage traditions, because there's a checks and balance built in. But you get self-realized people who get very self-important and they lose it because of their self-importance. I like working with His Holiness because he's busting me all the time. I go in there one day and he looks at me and he says, "You've been teaching a lot, watch the pride." And I said, "Busted, thank you." I find that useful. And he's always busting me. So it's useful. So that's the Cassian system of the problems that come up. But as a beginning, it's a good thing to do and you'll like it.
Do you have a question, Ben?
So I have one question. We only have a few more minutes left anyway,
Sure.
so just so you know, I want to do a meditation. But I am interested in the bad habits that you mentioned a few times tonight. What are some examples of some of the bad habits that people can practice if they're not?
Okay. Let me show you one that's common. We see it all the time in mindfulness people. If this is the rising and falling in my breath, and this is my awareness, and my awareness is off here somewhere, I train my awareness, I direct the awareness towards the breath. So after a while, I get pretty good at picking up the breath, right? So the awareness, the rising breath, and I pick up a patch of that rising breath. And as it's continuing, I go off and take a vacation and engage in all that background noise of thought. And here comes the falling breath, and I got that. Got a patch of it, piece of it, and then I go back and engage in all that thought activity again. And I got this one again. Now I can develop the illusion, which is not incorrect, that I'm staying on every cycle of the breath. That's correct, right? Now Tibetans call that necha, partial staying, or patchy staying. Now look at the difference. This is called complete staying. So it's not good enough to stay over time. Cross-sectionally, you also have to stay completely at any given point in time and not divide your attention. But a common thing that many meditators get into is it never is pointed out to them that they're dividing their attention. And we do that all the time in ordinary reality, and we do that in the meditation retreats. There's no concept of partial staying in Burmese mindfulness. So it's not likely they're going to get exposed to it. So we see many people with mindfulness who make that mistake and never correct it because no one's ever reminded them to correct it. That's just one of many examples, but it's a common one. Does that answer your question?
Okay.
Yeah.
First, I just want to say thank you. Thank you for everything you're doing and also for preservation. I think that's really incredible and admirable. I'm probably not alone when I say this, but I have a very busy corporate lifestyle. I have a very intense job, 90-hour weeks very often. I think a lot of people my age, I'm in my mid-20s, don't find the time in their lives to do this type of work, and it's really important. If I have 10 minutes a day, what do you suggest I do with that 10 minutes to get just even close to what you're describing?
I would say that if you try and play the piano and you bang away at the keys for 10 minutes, over the weeks you never make music. It's just noise, so you get sick of it and you don't ever practice again. So practicing for 10 minutes is going to be like that. However, if you took a couple days or a week and you really played the piano intensively to the point that you could make music and you got the feedback that you could make some simple songs from it, then it would be easier to continue from there. That's human nature. So what I would suggest is that you find some way of getting a weekend or a week that you could learn the basics and then build upon that skill 10 minutes a day. But to say he's going to do it in 10 minutes, I wouldn't suggest it's not going to give you the illusion it's going to work. I was teaching with Denmo Lotso Rinpoche. I did for 15 years. He was the head of Namgyal Monastery, the Dalai Lama's monastery. And one time in the early 80s, a Western student raised his hand and said, I get lazy in my everyday practice. What do I do with that? And he shot back. He said, no. He said, for you Westerners, that's not it. He said, for monks in the monastery are lazy, but for you Westerners, your laziness is busyness. That's your laziness. But one of the things I suggest is that we began this meditation early tonight with a pre-meditation routine. And it becomes like what we call in Western psychology, cue-induced learning. Start setting up your posture, set your intention towards awakening, call forth the retinue of all the masters, make the gift waves, request for the gift waves of influence, set up all the positive qualities, and then go into your meditation. It's like the way basketball players do warm-ups for 10 or 15 minutes so they get the game face on. If you do the same pre-meditation routine the same way each time, then when you go into it would take you 5 minutes. When you go into the meditation, you don't start from scratch. You start from where you left off the previous day. You got your meditation game face on. So the pre-meditation routine makes a difference, I think.
Okay, we have, 5 minutes left, approximately? Okay, so I just want to mention that if you could tell us a little bit, Dan, in a couple of minutes about the rebuilding and of the boarding school and monastery in Nepal that you're working on.
The problem with Tibet being invaded by the Chinese 50 years ago is that they had their own version of Kristallnacht, and they spent a week burning all the texts in all the monasteries throughout Tibet. They burned 100,000 volumes on states of mind in a week. About 80,000 volumes of that have been reconstructed. But the transmissions that go from generation to generation, we say go from heart to heart. So with the disruption of that culture, the transmissions were disrupted, and some of them have come back and some haven't come back. That's why other countries that are indigenously Tibetan, like a large indigenous population in Nepal on the one hand, and Bhutan on the other hand, are important. Because those are the countries where the transmissions go on uninterruptedly for generations from heart to heart. But the trouble with Nepal is that in 1954, the government developed a national education policy. And the policy was such that they would subsidize kids from villages to go to school. That's a good thing, they can get an education. Although most of the kids are too poor and have to work the farm, so they don't go anyway. But they could conceivably go to school, but the policy, unfortunately, they made the decision that the kids who went to school would only learn Nepali and English, which is for the last 2 generations, the indigenous Tibetan population, which is a third of Nepal, can't speak its own language again, or read its own text, or do its own practices. So that means in the next 10, 20 years, all the Tibetan teachings will die out in Nepal. So what we're doing is we're trying to take all the village kids who wouldn't otherwise go to school, pay for them to go to boarding school and teach them Tibetan language, Tibetan history, and Tibetan practices. We started with 22 kids. We have now 38 kids. And they go home once a month from boarding school a year, and the grandparents who still speak speak Tibetan were saying, this is amazing, the kids know all the prayers and practices again. So we have a hope that we're going to reboot this tradition. So we're trying to send all the kids, the Kali Gandaka River Valley in Mustang, Nepal is the great sacred corridor that all the teachers walked upon, like Padmasambhava and Atisha, bringing the teachings from India to Tibet. And it was originally a very indigenous Bon area where all the cave yogis lived. All that's dying out or be gone in the next 20 years. So our first vision was to reboot the culture by teaching them their own language. The second is to build a spiritual campus, which is the hub of this Kali Gandaka River Valley for the Bon, and then so that there are the monks are now we have a temple we're building and a place for 100 monks. So the monks will eventually get integrated in doing the harvest rituals and the protection rituals and the marriage ceremonies and the dying rituals and all that kind of stuff again. And then the third part of the project is to bring the cave yogis and hermitage yogis back who do all the advanced teachings, to set up a Western guest house so that for 50 Westerners, our advanced students can go there and take courses directly from the cave yogis if they're qualified. And then the cave yogis have a market for the teaching, so they come back before they all die out. And the Westerners can learn the most advanced teachings on the planet. And everybody wins in this arrangement, so that's what we're trying to do.
And Dan, you're working with some young female lamas as well, aren't you?
Well, at Menri Monastery, there was 85 women nuns, and the first thing they had a temple and they had living quarters, but they didn't have a good infrastructure. So the well went bad, so we built a new well and water supply. They didn't have the electricity kept going off, so we built in a big generator, so they have permanent electricity now. They didn't have winter heat, so we put in baseboard heating. It's fireproof, and so now they have heat. And we bought them a car so they can bring in the teaching and bring in their own food. And then we got His Holiness Manfred S. to agree to give them the same 14 years of doctoral training in spiritual studies the same way that the boys get. So they're getting the same Geshe training that the boys get, including they have their own debate team now. And the only thing that's missing is that we need a 3-year retreat master. And we had one. A young woman in her 30s was a very good yogi, and she died. Bus that she was on visiting the Dalai Lama went over the side of the mountain, and she died. So we found a great woman master in Amdo, but the Chinese won't give her a visa, so now I'm doing these, because I teach peak performance courses. I'm doing a series of peak performances courses for chief executives in China to try and get them to give me some influence so I can get them to have some effect on the Chinese government to free the visa up. That's the last piece to get in place. There's a lot of work. But we want to have the women culture come back. Half of the women are a sad lot. They're victims, they're adults and women who are mainly just hanging out because they're victims of rape and torture from escape from China. And then we have about half of the women are kids. And we're putting our cards in the next generation. Those kids 20 years from now will be great women yogis. Because in the Bon tradition, there are always as many great women yogis as men yogis, and we're trying to reboot that tradition. We want it back strong. And that's about a 20-year plan. So.
All right. Well, how about just a very tiny little ending of a meditation?
I'll do something particular.
Okay.
I'll give you a sense of what the pointing out instructions work like.
Wonderful. And I just want to thank everybody, because we're going to end the evening in the meditation, for coming tonight and being here with our very special guest, Dan, who has illuminated us with his tremendous wisdom. So please join me in our appreciation for Dan being here.
Just try and follow this meditation. Okay? Just listen and follow along. Let the mind follow along what's being pointed out. Open your eyes. Look into the surrounding empty space that saturates everything. Keep looking into that empty space with your eyes open. Mix your awareness into the empty space, and the empty space into your awareness, so it's one field of empty awareness space, saturating everything, everywhere. Now keep looking at that field of empty awareness space, and come to see that there's something about that field or the point of observation of the field that's absolutely timeless. There's something about the field that doesn't come and go in time, that's changeless, timeless. Identify the changeless, timeless aspect of that field that's beyond things coming and going in time. The events in the field will still come and go in time, but the field itself is changeless and timeless. Directly experience that. Always right here. Changeless, timeless awareness. Next, come to see that that empty awareness space extends in all directions, panoramically. So it's limitless. And when you try and take that vast scope of limitless awareness, some of you may notice that the ordinary mind imposes edges or boundaries on that space. And if you notice edges or boundaries anywhere, take your awareness and pour the awareness right into those edges and boundaries, like pouring awareness into awareness, until all those edges and boundaries disappear like mist dissolving into the atmosphere. Until the scope gets more vast. And if you extend your awareness even further out, if there are other edges and boundaries that the ordinary mind is imposing, open into them as basic space. And keep doing that until there are no edges or boundaries, until you get a taste of the limitlessness of this field of empty awareness space. Timeless, changeless on the one hand, boundless and limitless on the other hand. And come to see that your basis of operation, where you're coming from, is operating out of that field of ocean light, changeless, boundless awareness, or being that field. Don't visualize an ocean, it's just a metaphor for awareness, the scope of the awareness. Ocean light, changeless, boundless awareness, always right here. And then ease up and let the ordinary content of the mind recur like waves arising in an ocean. The difference is where you're looking from. You're looking from being that ocean-like awareness. Like an ocean of changeless, boundless awareness viewing its own waves. Relax the mind enough to let the content come up like waves arising in an ocean. Like an ocean of changeless, boundless awareness viewing its own waves. Don't hold the mind too tight. An ocean can't view its own waves if there are no waves. Ease up and let the content recur like waves arising in an ocean, viewed from the vantage point of ocean-like awareness itself. And whatever arises will arise within that vast spaciousness with no grab whatsoever. It just arises in that space, that vast limitless spaciousness, and disappear back into the spaciousness. And right here is your first taste of what's called the path of spacious freedom. Like an ocean viewing its own waves. Take the view that whatever arises, whatever the content is, no matter how varied it is, like a wave. It's all just empty constructions of mind. It's all lively awareness. Like an ocean viewing its own waves. And whatever arises is another momentary expression of emptiness, liveliness. The whole show is awareness expressing itself to itself, knowing itself through its own expressions. Like an ocean viewing its own waves. And then you can bring it to a close. That's a pointing out instruction from Sri Simha, who was Papa Sambhava's meditation teacher. I hope that it would give you a taste of the pointing out instructions. These are things that you wouldn't think of in a million years, but once you point it out, it's obvious. You can open up the whole world of ocean-like, changeless, boundless awareness, just by the clarity of the instructions. That's what I was trying to say earlier. How many people got a taste of ocean like changeless, boundless awareness? Not bad with no preparation. It's good. A good start. See how that works? Good.
All right. Thank you all again for coming tonight.
Thank you.